The courier ship was older than agriculture. It landed outside the World Registry office at 9 in the morning, local time, like a client with an appointment. Priya Nand watched it come down from her office window. She was a probate clerk. She settled the estates of people who died without wills, without heirs, and mostly without anyone noticing. That morning she had been arranging a burial. A man had died in a rented room with no name on file. It was somebody's job to see he went into the ground with dignity, and for 11 years that somebody had been Priya. She was 34. Her entire authority was a stamp, a ledger, and a small fund for flowers. The ship was the size of a bus, scarred by an unimaginable journey. It ignored 3 militaries, every head of state, and the entire diplomatic corps of Earth. It transmitted one request in flawless legal language, translated into 200 tongues. It wished to be directed to the office responsible for the estates of the dead. By noon, the world's cameras were pointed at a modest municipal building. And Priya Nand, in her second-best cardigan, walked out to meet the visitor, because her supervisor had locked himself in the archive, and the queue, as she said later, was technically hers. The ship opened. No creature came out. Instead, it projected a document into the air, seals first. The seals alone would keep historians employed for a century. It was a will. The testator was a civilization. The lattice, the translators would render it. An empire of 900 worlds that had died by its own final census, of a slow and stately decline 1,000 years ago. It had spent its last strength on this. A lawful instrument and a messenger to carry it. Priya read the operative clause standing in a car park, while the world watched over her shoulder. Being ended, and our succession empty, we bequeath all that was ours to the species that sings to its dead. And beneath it, one line more. Identified, the third world of the yellow sun, the singer's Earth. It took 9 days to understand why Earth. The answer embarrassed every government that had spent those days claiming credit. The courier's records were open. It had traveled for 1,000 years, executing its dead empire's final instruction. Find the species that sings to its dead and give them everything. The phrase was not poetry. It was a legal test, defined with the lattice's terrible precision. A species that spends its wealth on its dead, who cannot repay. A species that sends its dead beyond its own reach, adorned, accompanied, addressed to no one. The courier had assessed 140 living civilizations against that test. The records showed each assessment patient and damning. Species that recycled their dead for protein. Species that deleted them. Species of great kindness among the living whose dead simply stopped mattering. 140 times the same conclusion. They do not sing. Continue. Then, drifting through the outer dark of an unremarkable system, it had intercepted a small human probe. Centuries old, coasting toward interstellar space. Aboard, a golden record. Music, greetings, the sounds of a world addressed to no one, expecting no answer. Sent by a species that also buried flowers with its dead. That built tombs that outlasted its nations. That spent, on those who could give nothing back, a measurable fraction of everything it had. The log entry that followed was brief. It has since been carved over the doors of more than one human building. They sing to their dead. They sang to us not knowing we were dead. The search is ended. Priya Nand read that entry the way everyone read it that week, with the hair standing up on her arms. Then, because she was a probate clerk and somebody had to, she read the rest of the will. That was how she became the first person to understand what Earth had actually inherited, and the first to be afraid of it. The estate was not treasure. The estate was 900 dead worlds and everything on them and between them, including a fleet. The inventory arrived in the second week, transmitted in dry, catalogued sections. The section titled Defensive Assets mothballed ended Earth's honeymoon with its inheritance overnight. 40,000 warships. The lattice had been old and slow in its dying and tidy. It had parked its navy the way it shelved its archives, preserved orbital arsenals around silent worlds. Dormant, the courier certified, awaiting the heir. The stakes stopped being sentimental at that number. A 1,000-year-old golden record had just made one mid-sized species, with 200 quarreling nations and a modest home fleet, the legal owner of the largest military force in the known galaxy. Every telescope Earth owned turned outward, waiting to see who else had heard. The answer took 4 months, then it arrived all at once. 9 fleets. They came out of deep space in formal staggered order, 9 armadas in 9 styles of hull, and took up stations around the solar system in a wide, punctilious circle. Weapons cold, transmitting continuously, not threats, filings. They were claimants, 9 species, each with history under the lattice, each contesting the will. One fleet represented a species whose worlds the lattice had annexed in some ancient consolidation. They claimed as dispossessed heirs. Another had served the Empire for 6,000 years. They claimed as forgotten kin. Another held old lattice territory now and claimed by possession. 9 grievances, 9 case files, 9 armadas parked at the edge of humanity's sky. And all 9, Earth realized with slow horror, were bound by a single procedural fact. Under the law the will itself invoked, disputes among claimants were settled not by war but by the executor of the estate. The will named its executor by the same test that named its heir. The office that tends the unclaimed dead of the heir species holds the rolls of this estate. 9 fleets, 40,000 inherited warships, the fate of 900 dead worlds. All of it now rested, by the explicit letter of galactic law, on the small municipal authority of the person whose job was burying the unnamed. Priya Nan's supervisor retired that Friday, citing health. The office was hers. The first hearing of the probate of the lattice convened 5 months after the courier landed. It was held in a leased concert hall, because no courtroom on Earth could seat 9 alien delegations. Priya Nan sat at a plain table with her stamp, her ledger, and a borrowed gavel she never once used. The great powers had fought viciously for that chair. The courier had ended the argument by publishing the executor clause with her name already appended. It had been watching the registry office for 4 months, it explained. Of all officials observed, only the clerk Nand had continued, throughout the crisis, to perform the estate's defining function. She had buried 11 unclaimed dead since its arrival. The rolls were current. The office was qualified. So the nations appointed advisors instead, 90 of them. Priya listened to the advisors for one morning, then set their briefs aside because every brief said the same thing in different words. Keep the fleet. Whatever else, keep the fleet. The claimant delegations were another education. Up close, they were not armadas. They were mourners and lawyers, and above all, they were old. The dispossessed heirs had rehearsed their grievance so long it had become liturgy. The servant species brought genealogies, chanted, proving 6,000 years of unpaid faithfulness. Each fleet had crossed the galaxy not really expecting justice. For 1,000 years there had been no forum where their claims could even be spoken. The lattice had died owing everyone. The universe had shrugged and left 9 peoples holding their grief with nowhere to file it. On the 3rd day, the eldest delegate of the servant species finished her chanted genealogy. She looked down at the small human at the plain table and asked the question all 9 fleets had crossed the dark to ask. Executor, will the heir hear us? Or will the heir keep everything as the strong have always done? The hall went silent. 90 human advisors held their breath. Priya Nand opened her ledger, the same battered municipal ledger, and uncapped her pen. The estate will hear every claim, she said. That is what an estate is for. Please begin at the beginning. I will be writing the names down, so speak slowly. The claims took 13 months to hear. Priya Nand wrote every one of them down by hand. The claimant species mistook that for ceremony at first. Later they understood it was the point. She ran the greatest probate in galactic history, exactly the way she had run a municipal office with a flower budget. Each grievance was entered in the rolls. Each was read back to its claimant, corrected, and certified. The dispossessed heirs wept, all of them, the first time their annexation was read aloud in the estate's own record. The estate acknowledging the wound was a thing their liturgy had never dared imagine. And the archive answered. That was the discovery that reshaped everything. The lattice had kept records the way it did everything, completely. Whatever a claimant asserted, the archive could test. The annexation was there in the Empire's own unsparing minutes, worse than the liturgy remembered. The 6,000 years of service were there, itemized, down to individual unpaid honors flagged by some ancient auditor as debts outstanding. The dead Empire, Priya realized with something like awe, had known exactly what it owed. It had simply run out of time and perhaps courage to pay. The archive held one more thing. She found it late, deep in the will schedules, in a clause every government advisor had skimmed because it contained no assets. The schedule of unfinished duties. The Lattice's list of its own unpaid debts prepared in its final century sealed for its heir. 9 entries, 9 peoples, the same 9 now parked around the sun, itemized, acknowledged, with the Empire's own assessment of what justice would have cost it. The will had never been a bequest of treasure. Priya understood that, sitting alone with the schedule at 2 in the morning. It was a case file handed across 1,000 years to whichever species could be trusted with it. The Lattice had not left Earth its wealth. It had left Earth its conscience, and 40,000 warships to make the payment stick. The question was whether the heir would pay debts it had never incurred, to strangers, from a fortune it had lately been calling its own. She scheduled the ruling for the anniversary of the courier's landing. She told no one what was in it. The night before the ruling, Earth's 9 most powerful governments made their final approach to Priya Nand. Together, in one room, so there could be no mistaking the weight of it. The stakes were recited to her like a sentence. 40,000 warships, security for 1,000 years, or 9 armed grudges at humanity's doorstep forever. The advisors had converged on a recommendation. Award the claimants symbolic settlements. Apologies, dignities, perhaps a world or two at the estate's margins. Keep the core, keep the arsenals. No power in history, their spokesman said, not unkindly, has ever been handed supremacy and given it away. The ones that tried did not survive their neighbors. Priya heard them out, because hearing people out was the whole of her training. Then she went home and did what she had done the night before every difficult estate of her career. She walked to the municipal cemetery, to the plain section her office maintained. The rows of the unclaimed, each grave marked with a name where a name had been found and a number where it had not, each one withstanding for flowers twice a year, out of a fund she had defended through 11 budget reviews. She stood there a long time, among the people nobody had wanted, whom somebody had buried properly anyway. The test was the whole answer. She had known it for months, really. The Lattice had searched 140 civilizations, and it had not been searching for power or wisdom or strength. It had possessed those beyond measure. They had not saved it. It had searched for the one disposition it judged fit to hold everything it had ever been. It had chosen the species that pays for flowers for strangers. Not because such a species was harmless, because such a species understood in its municipal bones the only truth probate ever teaches. Nothing is really yours. You hold it for a while. You settle the debts honestly. You hand the rest on in better order than you found it. If humanity kept the fleet, it would prove the courier's 1,000-year search had ended in error. And somewhere in her past argument, Priya Nand knew the archive would record that too. She went home and finished writing the ruling. It was 4 pages long, and it began with a burial. The ruling of the executor was read on the anniversary morning to 9 fleets, 200 nations, and an audience of 4 billion. It began where nobody expected. Item 1. The estate would bury its dead. 900 worlds of the Lattice held the unfinished funerals of a whole civilization, waiting 1,000 years. Before any asset moved, the estate would fund the completion of every rite the Lattice's own customs required. The claimant species, the 9 peoples who knew the Empire best, were invited to serve as honored stewards of that work, at the estate's expense. She watched 9 delegations go absolutely still. They understood before Earth's advisors did. The small human had just placed the Empire's death and their dignity above everyone's greed, including her own species. Item 2, the schedule of debts. She published it whole. The Lattice's own confession, 9 entries, and she ruled it valid. The estate would pay. The dispossessed heirs received their annexed worlds back, corrected in the rolls under their own oldest names. The servant species received the itemized worth of 6,000 years. Their genealogies entered in the estate's permanent record as creditors made whole. Claim by claim, she distributed the substance of 900 worlds to the peoples the dead empire itself had listed as its unpaid. Item 3, the fleet. The whole and 9 armadas and 1 planet held its breath. The estate notes, Priya Nand read, in the ledger-steady voice of a clerk certifying a burial. that every claimant and the heir has valued the defensive assets above all others, and that the testator, in 1,000 years of final instructions, mentioned them only once, under the heading of things to be disposed of. The executor finds no debt that a fleet can pay. The fleet is hereby classified with the remains of the deceased. It would be treated accordingly. Decommissioned, all 40,000 hulls. Consigned, squadron by squadron, to the Lattice's home star, which the Empire's own poets had called the first hearth. The dead do not need their sword, she read, and the living, all of us, will be better mourners without it lying between us. Cremation at scale. The greatest arsenal in the galaxy, ruled a body and sent to a star. The objections lasted 11 days. The historians of 9 species now agree that was remarkably short. They ended for a reason no strategist had modeled. Earth's own powers objected loudest, as Priya had known they would. But the executor clause was ironclad. The courier stood behind its clerk with 1,000 years of legal authority, and the 9 claimant species, who had arrived as rivals, discovered they had become something none of them had been in 10 centuries. Satisfied, each had been heard, paid, and honored out of a fortune the heir could have kept. The mathematics of grievance inverted. Any species that moved on Earth now would be moving against the executor who had made 8 other fleets whole. Standing behind her ruling was not an arsenal, but the published conscience of the galaxy's greatest empire. 9 armadas, arrayed to contest a will, found themselves instead its co-signatories. The funeral of the Lattice fleet took a year. It remains the most watched event in the history of any of the 10 species involved. Squadron by squadron, the warships lit their preserved engines for the last time and flew, crewless and stately, down the long approach to the first hearth. The claimant fleets escorted them, all 9 in mourning formation, and honor their war colleges had to reinvent from records 10 centuries old. 40,000 hulls, the accumulated dread of an age, went into the star over 340 days. Each squadron's end was a brief brightening in the hearth's corona, visible across the whole of the old imperial volume. On dead worlds tended by new stewards, that light fell on the Empire's completed graves. Priya Nand watched the final squadron go from the courier's own observation blister at its invitation, the only such invitation it ever extended. As the last brightness faded, the ancient machine spoke, unprompted, its first and only remark not required by procedure. 140 civilizations, it said. I was beginning to believe my makers had described a species that could not exist. Then it asked her, in the formal grammar of the roles, to certify the estate's principal duty discharged. She stamped it there on the glass over the light of the hearth. The courier logged the sound. It is the most reproduced audio recording in the galaxy. A rubber stamp certifying the end of empires as a cause of war. 1 thump, ledger flat, final. What Earth kept in the end made the species wealthy in the only way that lasted. The ruling's final items had drawn little attention on the day, overshadowed by the burning of a fleet. But they compounded. The estate retained the archive not as owner but as librarian. The will's knowledge held in trust, open by application to every species, including the 9. It retained the courier's charts of 140 civilizations, the greatest survey of the living galaxy ever made. And it retained the duty, formally, in perpetuity. Earth's registry of the unclaimed dead now maintained, beside its municipal rolls, the rolls of the Lattice, and with them a standing obligation the ruling defined in 1 sentence. Every human government since has found it politically impossible to defund. The office of the executor remains open to any species that dies without an heir. They have come, too. Twice in the decades since, the deep arrays have caught the signature of a courier, built in imitation of the first, limping in from the dark with the last will of a failing people, addressed to the third world of the yellow sun. Attention, the office that sings. Both estates were administered. Both people's dead were tended, their debts paid, their memory shelved with honor in the growing archive. The galaxy has begun, cautiously, to believe in a strange new institution. That dying need not mean vanishing, that owing need not outlive you, that there is a small office on a blue world where the ending of things is handled properly. The 9 fleets went home years ago. but each left one ship behind by unanimous instinct, and the 9 vessels hold a shared orbit above Earth to this day. Officially, they are liaison missions. Unofficially, everyone knows what they are. 9 species watched a fortune arrive on Earth and watched Earth read it as a list of other people's wounds. Each of them left a witness, so that if it ever happens again to anyone, there will be someone on station who saw how it is done. Humanity calls them the 9 mourners and steers its traffic around their stillness and tells its children what they are watching for. They are watching, the children are told, to see if we meant it. Priya Nand refused every promotion, every honor, and every statue. She accepted exactly one recognition in her whole life, and it found her too late to refuse. She worked another 31 years in the registry office, most of them exactly as before. She buried the unclaimed. She defended the flower fund through 19 more budget reviews. Interns came to be trained in what the manuals now called estate practice, and what she called, to the end, the job. The job's whole doctrine fit in the 2 sentences she said to every new hire on their first morning. Everyone's file closes. The measure of an office, and I suspect of a species, is how it treats the files nobody else will open. She died at 88 in the spring. Her own file listed next of kin, so her estate never passed through her office. But the courier, ancient and patient in its long orbit, transmitted a request within the hour. No authority on Earth dreamed of refusing it. The funeral of Priya Nand was attended by the mourning vessels of 10 civilizations. 9 ancient, 1 young. The lattice courier, which had crossed 1,000 years to find one species that sings to its dead, descended through the atmosphere it had first entered on a morning in another century. It took station, low and silent, over a municipal cemetery, over the plain section, the rows of the named and the numbered, where a probate clerk had asked to be buried among her clients. And there, over her grave, the last servant of a dead empire did the thing it had waited its whole long errand to witness. It had assessed 140 civilizations for the capacity. It had found one. It had never, in all its logs, recorded performing the act itself. The courier sang. The recording exists. It is the lattice's funeral chant, the one their 900 worlds had gone silent too gradually ever to receive. Given voice at last by their own machine over the woman who buried their empire properly. In a language no living being speaks. Above a grave marked with a name, beside graves marked with numbers. All of them, everyone, withstanding for flowers. Twice a year in perpetuity, item 1 in the ledger. The file remains open. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. A new one leaves Earth every day.